Well, good morning all together. My name is Martin Brüsisa. I come from Munich University, and I have had the occasion here to participate in a meeting on the atlas of the political atlas of the world that has been created by researchers from MGIMO Institute under the leadership of Professor Melville. I also have the pleasure today to give a lecture here to you. My lecture will be on the questions of measuring democracy and governance. This is a broad theme. One may ask, measuring democracy and governance, first of all, is this at all possible? Because democracy is something very broad and vague, and it will be very difficult to define it. There will be immediately probably controversy on how to conceptualize it. So how then will we be able to arrive at any standards or measuring rods, measuring yardsticks according to which we can measure democracy? And the same, of course, holds true for such a broad concept such as governance. That's true, and I hope I will be able to. I will probably not provide you with really the ready-made recite at the end of how to measure democracy and governance, but I will try to provide you with some sort of guidance on how to avoid the most common pitfalls and fallacies in designing concepts to measure democracy and governance. I will also try to provide you with, well, an overview of the state of research that exists on the measurement of democracy and governance, so that you can draw from this your own lessons on how you would evaluate democracy, the quality of democracy and the quality of governance. Obviously, the second question that comes into mind when you embark upon such a task is why is it at all necessary to measure democracy and governance? I mean, probably every country, each country has a different institutional arrangement, a different historically developed ideas and notions of how democracy should function and what's the legitimate way of selecting rulers in a country and how they should govern and which and what democracy is and what good governance means in a country, definitely. So this is an immediate question that comes into mind when you think about how to measure this. Well, I think you can identify three drivers, three important developments, perhaps over the last decade that have created a need and also a demand for measurements, for measures of governance and democracy. The first, most important driver is probably the end of the East-West confrontation. This means that democracy is an unchallenged, or not an unchallenged, but a universal model that does not have an equally legitimate alternative. There is a broad range of democracies that exists today. There are also, of course, countries or regimes that one would immediately describe as authoritarian, that describe themselves as democratic, as people's democracy, for example, of North Korea. So, which indicates that even such dictatorships feel the need to have a reference or to legitimize their own system of rule by referring to democracy, whatever they mean under democracy. With democracy becoming a universal model, immediately comes up the next question: how to differentiate between the different models of democracy that we can find in the world. Can we be, and a follow-up question, can we be satisfied with the quality of democracy even in established democracies in the Western world, for example, where we have a longer tradition of democratic governance, and don't we observe at the same time some deterioration of the quality of democracy in these countries? For example, increasing rates of abstention in votings, in elections. This development has led has raised questions on what really is meant and how should democracy be conceived, and has, I think, led to the emergence of a renewed interest in the measurement of democracy. The second important driver has been globalization. That today, at a mouse click, you can easily inform yourself on the situation, what the government does in a remote country, with globalization, with the increasing connectedness of all parts of the world, obviously the streams of information have been quicker, and countries are to an increasing extent trying to learn from the best practices exercised and performed in other parts of the world. With globalization, one can also observe an increasing role of international agencies such as the World Bank or the OECD or the UNDP, for example. These agencies operate, of course, in a way in a world of where there's no hierarchic structure, but rather a situation of equal sovereign states, to improve, to achieve an impact as an agency in a non-hierarchic environment, it is important to develop universally acceptable paradigms, programs, action programs, and universally acceptable standards that can be applied and that are acceptable for all the member states, for all the states where such an agency works. With this comes then the interest of agencies in developing standards of good governance, for example, that enable them to distinguish and differentiate countries according to their level of good governance. Another development that has been seen in this context is, of course, also the finding that apparently it's not just the good policy content that matters for development success of a country, but the institutions, the quality of the institutions that process policies, that make policies, is very important for the success of developmental efforts. And this has then led to a focus, a refocus of agency interest in the role of governance. And thirdly, the third driving force is a more specific development trend, a paradigm change that may be labeled with the term new public management. You might have heard about it. It's the idea originating in the US of organizing the public sector according to entrepreneurial principles, and this means that contrary to the traditional Weberian model of public administration that is hierarchically organized and governed by law, and where basically administration is the implementation of laws, and legal rationality is the most important organizational criterion on which public administration is built. New public management, a new public management way of thinking suggests to transfer principles of organization from the private sector into the public sector. And among these principles is the principle of decentralization, that is a high level of autonomy for units of the state, for individual ministries, for local governments, for example, and to concede autonomy to these units, but at the same time set up benchmarks, set up measurement standards according to which the performance of these units can be compared and can be controlled. Advocates of new public management have suggested this model of organization because they believe that this will lead to efficiency improvements in the public sector. And in the OECD world, new public management has increasingly gained importance and has become, I think, the most strongly promoted model. And yeah, with new public management, there is this. This entails also this idea of that the performance of the public sector, the governance performance, is measurable and can be. There can be. It's possible to define standards according to which we can compare the performance not only of units within states, but also of states against other states. So these are the three drivers, I think, that lead us to ask this question of how to measure democracy and governance. Now my presentation will be structured in three parts. I will start with an attempt to conceptualize democracy and governance, how to define these two very broad terms, and then I follow with the consequences of the conceptualization, how to measure democracy and governance, and as these two terms, as we will see, constitute complex concepts. To measure them, it's necessary to disaggregate them, to break them down into small pieces, into measurable units. And if you have done this, and I think it's unavoidable to do this, otherwise you cannot come up with any valid measurement, then the question arises how to reconstruct, how to recompose these individual units. This means that questions of aggregation arise, how to arrive at really informative, meaningful, composite measures of democracy and governance. I'll start with the definitional issues. Here I think if you look at the literature in political science, there's a very broad array of approaches to define and to conceptualize democracy. It's pretty hard to get an overview. I think what might help, my suggestion perhaps, is to do a broad distinction between dichotomous concepts on the one hand and gradualist concepts on the other hand. I have quoted a number of examples for researchers who prefer dichotomous concepts of democracy. That means a concept that juxtaposes democracy with autocracy. Whereas a gradualist concept is a concept that does not draw such sharp lines between democracy and the alternative to democracy, however it is precisely described. I'll start with one definition of one approach to have a dichotomous concept of democracy. This has been prominently advanced by Adam Przeworski and his colleagues. They argue that there are three conditions that must be fulfilled to call a country a democracy, and that is, they argue that first of all we need an electoral process. The chief executive and the legislature should be elected. They don't say popularly, because obviously there's a difference between presidential and parliamentary systems and the different modes of electing them. However, elections is what matters. Second, we need to have more than one party, so that there is a choice for citizens whom to elect. And third, the third condition is incumbents should be removable, and there should be proof of removals of incumbent governments. They say countries that fulfill all these three conditions can be termed democracy. All other countries that violate one of these conditions, that would be sufficient to call a country an autocracy. This is a clear-cut, dichotomous concept of democracy that puts very precise conditions, and I think the advantage is that it allows a clear classification, and it does not admit any gray zones of countries, well, partly democratic, partly autocratic, partly authoritarian, and it does not run. It does not fall victim to this danger of what Giovanni Sartori called degreeism. That means that that by broadening, by widening a concept, you run the risk of transforming qualitative differences, categorical differences, into quantitative differences. So that has been identified by Sartori as one of the problems in attempts to classify, to develop concepts in political science and to classify such concepts as democracy. Sartori also, I think, is a clear advocate of such a dichotomous approach of conceptualization. He has said that one should distinguish between what makes democracy possible, on the one hand, this is one question, and the other question is what makes democracy more democratic. So one should clearly distinguish these two questions. If you mix them up, you end up in conceptual stretching or degreeism. On the other hand, you have the advocates of gradualist concepts. They argue that with their concepts, a more differentiated measurement is possible. Their concepts are less culturally biased. They are applicable to democracies in different cultural regions of the world because they do not put so much emphasis on specific necessary conditions, but rather allow a broader variety of features of democracy. And also, since they are gradualist, their concepts allow to capture the dynamics of change. So if a country is moving from democracy to authoritarian rule, this could be, according to the advocates of gradualist concepts, could be better captured by such a gradualist concept, because you can better show the nuances. Now, the classic, perhaps, classic advocate, the classic theoretician of theorist of a gradualist notion of democracy is probably Robert Dahl. He makes a very clever distinction between, on the one hand, a minimum set of conditions to be fulfilled to call a country democracy. That is what he calls polyarchy. And he says that basically two conditions are necessary to be fulfilled. That is, you need to have a competitive process where you have different alternatives and also access of competing candidates to the media, so implying certain political participation rights. And on the other hand, you need political participation rights of the people that they are able to decide between these alternatives. If these two conditions are fulfilled, you can call a country a polyarchy, which is a term he created. But a polyarchy is created because Dahl makes clear that this is not the ideal model of democracy. The ideal democratic process is something that has nowhere been reached in the world, according to Dahl, and that can also be described. And this is really perhaps the point of orientation for conceptualizing and for evaluating democracy. The ideal democratic process, according to Dahl, requires that all concerned citizens are included into the democratic decision making, that there are equal chances of participation, that there are equal voting rights, there are equal rights to select and define issues exercised by all citizens, and there is an equal understanding of issues among citizens. Obviously, these are very tough conditions, and I think it's very convincing with Dahl that to assume that these conditions are nowhere in the world given, in equal understanding of issues, for example. Obviously, with the differentiation and the heterogeneity of societies that exist, we don't have these conditions. However, for Dahl it is important that these two polyarchy conditions are given, and therefore these conditions have, in a way, since they are also, one can well show their logical interconnectedness, they have, in a way, have had a paradigmatic influence, perhaps, in comparative politics and in the comparative study of democratization. There are other definitions that I have just listed here. For example, by Kenneth Bollen, who says that, well, democracy is the extent to which the political power of the elite is minimized and that of the non-elite is maximized. This is, of course, as you can easily probably conceive, a clearly gradualist concept that also probably implies ambitious and demanding requirements for any existing democracy. And then there is another suggestion of a definition by David Beetham, who is the author of an important lead author of an important approach and comparative study of democracy, the so-called democratic audit. He argues that, well, democracy has two elements: the popular control of public decisions and decision makers, and the equality between citizens in relation to those decisions, which is also a matter of degree. And this is how then his approach, the democratic audit, is structured. Now, coming from democracy to governance, and we are not, of course, have not arrived at a clear concept of and a clear definition of democracy. I would just stress that these two ways are possible and are also equally legitimate as approaches to conceptualize democracy. It depends on what you want to show and where you want to go finally. Coming from democracy to governance, now the first question that arises here is governance perhaps a substitute for democracy? Democracy is value loaded, obviously. If you say that the country is democratic, you assume that there may be an alternative status of a country that is authoritarian, with arguing that some countries are non-democratic, obviously you put a big label on countries, and they might not be satisfied with this description. So, since this term is inherently value-laden, I think one can explain the emergence and the growing popularity of governance as an attempt to provide an alternative to democracy that is less value-laden, that is more functional, perhaps more oriented in processes and in functions. And I have provided you with one definition advanced by an international agency, UNDP, that shows clearly that that is much more value-free, perhaps, in its approach. Now, obviously, in describing governance, the agencies have also made attempts to define what is better governance, what is worse governance, and here is quoted here on the slide an attempt by the World Bank to define what good governance is. Now, you see, there's no mentioning of election in this definition. However, there's mentioning of participation, which take a look, strong civil society participation in public affairs. There's also mentioning of accountability, an executive arm of government accountable for its action. This avoids the normative connotations associated with democracy and the focus on elections, but at the same time tries to state functionally equivalent conditions that must be fulfilled. Because obviously a civil society participating in public affairs, I mean, the conventional means to do this is then through elections, but you may also imagine other modes and models of participation. One famous example that's often stated here is perhaps the Shura, this consultative forum that has been installed by the Arab monarchs to organize a consultation with stakeholders, with important citizens, where affairs are discussed, but the final decisions, of course, are then taken by the monarch. Then, if you work with this concept, and if we take this concept for a moment of good governance, the question arises: is good governance possible without democracy? So, can we have enlightened absolutist leaders who are able to govern a country and to achieve development aims without the holding of free elections? I think one has to distinguish here between output legitimacy on the one hand and input legitimacy on the other hand. Input legitimacy, this is another concept that has been developed in political science, for example, to also understand the the legitimacy, different sources of legitimacy possible for agencies that do not consist of elected representatives, such as the EU Commission. Input legitimacy would be legitimacy provided by a process of election, by the selection of representative rulers, whereas output legitimacy refers to the performance of a government, an agency, and tries and argues that as long as the performance is convincing and people are satisfied with the performance of a regime, it doesn't matter so much whether it is elected according to fair and free democratic procedures. So there are people who argue that good governance is possible without democracy. However, and they refer then to output legitimacy basically as an argument why this is possible, and also as an argument to limit perhaps the possibility of having good governance without democracy. As long as it generates output legitimacy, as the performance is satisfactory, it's possible to have good governance without democracy. However, I think this is insofar questionable as to have good governance, you need to have an informed decision by rulers, informed decision-making process, and to get this unbiased information, authoritarian systems need to have some sort of accountability, some sort of participation that is not limited to particular classes or particular circles or groups that constitute the incumbent elites. Otherwise, in the long run, this will not work due to information processing problems. I would argue. So the conclusion one can draw from here is perhaps that there is an overlap between good governance and democracy, and in the long run, I suppose good governance requires democratic procedures to be sustainable good governance. Then the next question arises, governance or governing. This is a broad discussion that has been conducted in the field of public administration and comparative government. If you want to develop a concept such as governance, you have to delineate it against other terms such as governing. So you have to make clear what governance means in contrast with governing or with government. Here the suggestion has been made that governance is in a way an extension of traditional governing insofar as it is no longer just based on hierarchy as a mode of organization, but it includes also networks. This means that we have equally powerful actors engaging in a limited cooperation that benefits their own interests. Imagine, for example, a government with economic actors, business organizations trying to arrive at certain environmental standards that are valid for the entire branch, the entire sector of industry. This is a typical network arrangement, as often hierarchy. So the hierarchy would be the government imposes a law and a regulation, and the companies have to obey by this regulation. The network approach would be that the companies are assisted by the government to arrive at a regulation that is mutually agreed among companies and is then enforced by these companies as a self-binding code of conduct. Markets obviously are also an alternative to hierarchy, and once governments, I think very simplifying in West European countries, governments have clearly recognized that traditional hierarchic ways of governments are not always the best and are not effective finally, and so governing has increasingly developed into governance in the sense of trying to involve stakeholders, trying to come to joint agreements, and trying to use networks and markets as alternatives, as complementary mechanisms to the traditional way of hierarchic imposition of rules. So this more West European perhaps or discussion that is important in OECD countries, in advanced industrial countries, has led to a particular framing, a particular definition of the term governance that is distinct against or distinct from governing or government. Now, I think a good working definition of governance can be developed by acknowledging that states today and governments today cannot achieve anything by just imposing rules, by just governing, by steering, by rowing. They need to have an embeddedness. They need to be accountability procedures that actually, in a way, are able, if they are well organized, they are able to, these accountability procedures are able to strengthen the power, the steering capacities of a government. I think there are two failures of governance. One is the attitist failure. That means you have a too strong state that dominates the economy, for example, and society. I mean, the state socialist countries would be an example for this. And on the other hand, you have the failure of a too weak state that is not able to, for example, enforce a monopoly on the use of violence, on the use of force, or to enforce binding rules for all parts of the population. Somehow the corridor and the range of the range of well-governed countries, of good governance, is between these two extreme cases. And to avoid these two extreme cases, you need a combination of executive capacity, and that means the steering capacity of executive state power in the traditional way, and of executive accountability. That means mechanisms that keep the executive in check against misuses, against well, so-called predatory elites that capture the state and exploit it for their own private purposes. Now, from these conceptual clarifications, we move on to how to some considerations on how to disaggregate a concept into measurable components. The most important standard, the most important criterion here is validity. Validity means the simple question: do the components measure what the concept claims to describe? Do the indicators that we use to measure good governance or democracy, do they really measure what our concept is intended to reflect? Again, we have started with this distinction between dichotomous concepts and gradualist concepts. I think from there you can draw one conclusion for how to describe the status of components that we have, that we should use to measure democracy and governance. If you prefer to have a dichotomous concept, clearly delineating democracy against autocracy, I think, and describing democracy as a bounded whole consisting of necessary components. That means that if you have these three components, I mentioned the example of Przeworski previously. If these three components are in place, then the concept is in place. Then we can indeed talk about a democracy if we have free elections, if we have a change of incumbents, and if we have what I have here, the alternatives as different parties one can choose from. On the right side, the definition I suggested. Okay. So dichotomous concepts consist of necessary components that are not substitutable by other components. This means that if you don't have free elections, but you have several parties, this is still not a democracy. If you have free elections and if you have several parties, but you do not have a real change in government, so there's only one dominant party and all the other parties are for a long time period in opposition and have no chance of becoming ever the governing party, then there is no democracy. I think the alternative is if you have a gradualist concept, then the components of your concepts are substitutable to some degree, to a high degree, to a lower degree. This is, I think, implied by choosing a gradualist concept. You can obviously imagine also combinations of substitutable and necessary components. I will give you an example for this. This is a concept that has been developed by Wolfgang Merkel, a German political scientist, and his colleagues. No. He's often asked this question, but he then always immediately distances himself.
These were a reason to distance themselves.
Now, they argue that democracy, in their understanding, consists of 5 partial regimes. Regimes in the sense of sets of rules and conventions, informal and formal rules. And the key regime is in the middle here, the electoral regime, free elections, free and fair elections. And then there are 4 other regimes that they consider important. Political participation rights, these are rights of assembly, organization, rights of freedom of opinion, the possibility to express one's opinion. Civil liberties also belong to their concept of an embedded democracy. This means all the judicial rights one can have as a person. Horizontal accountability is the idea, well, it's opposed to vertical accountability. Civil liberties imply a vertical accountability. That is, the state is bound in its actions by the Constitution, and certain basic personal freedoms cannot be infringed or violated by state action. Horizontal accountability refers to the separation of powers, to the existence of an independent judiciary, and the existence of a mechanism of checks and balances to keep power holders in check. And finally, their fifth dimension is the so-called effective power to govern. This means that once you have democratically elected incumbents, they also need to be able to effectively exercise their power to govern. The example where such a power has not existed is perhaps the Chilean case, where there were enclaves. The military leadership for a long time by the constitution was not subject to the authority of democratically elected governments, and thus the effective power to govern of these groups was limited by constitutional restrictions that arose from, of course, the particular transition of Chile coming from a military dictatorship, and the way this transition was negotiated between the generals, the army on the one hand, and the civil society representatives on the other hand. Now, what Merkel and colleagues do not include into their concept of democracy are the socio-economic conditions. The social rights, the socio-economic performance of democracy is not part of the concept of democracy. So it's clearly a procedural concept with a procedural focus. And what they also take as given is the framework condition of a coherent, consistent state. In countries where statehood is problematic, where citizenship is disputed among different groups of the population, different ethnic groups, a basic framework condition for democracy is problematic, jeopardized, but acceptance of the state framework is not part of the definition of democracy, though they clearly separate this. Now, this is an example of a more necessary and a less necessary component of democracy in the concept. The electoral regime is the key component. If the electoral regime is a functional regime, if it works, if you have free and fair elections, then you can talk about a democracy. If civil liberties are violated, but you have fair elections, you can still talk about a democracy, but it's not a constitutional democracy and not an embedded democracy. but rather they call it a defective democracy.
So there can be a shift within this framework to the left, to the right, and different regimes.
Precisely. They use this framework. It's a theoretically derived framework to classify, to structure, to differentiate between different types of democracies with particular weaknesses, particular defects, they call it. And they classify the defects according to these partial regimes. As long as the electoral regime is working, you can talk about a democracy. This is the bottom line that separates democracies from autocracies. Within the field of democracies, you have different types of democracies, diminished subtypes, they call it, where civil liberties may be violated, political participation rights may be violated, horizontal accountability may be limited. This is the example of a delegative democracy, for example, where the executive controls the appointment of the judiciary, and it's very questionable, or where the executive has a far-reaching control of the parliament. That would be a limited, a defective democracy according to their concept. But the necessary component is the electoral regime. Okay, here this is a way of again showing the difference between these two ways of coming from concepts to components. One, this is based on Boolean logic, Boolean algebra. One is the AND logic, and the other one is the OR logic. The AND logic is the logic of necessary components, and the OR logic is the logic of substitutable components. I have tried to give a simple example here with a concept consisting of two components, x1 and x2, and epsilon would be the concept, the same here. Epsilon is the concept.
X1 and x2 are variables.
Yeah, exactly, yeah, are the components that we use to measure the concept. If you decide, now I have to somehow, maybe I switch to this microphone, then I can show this a bit. If you decide to opt for a gradualist, for a dichotomous concept, the logic will lead you, if you clearly conceptualize this concept, if you disaggregate it into components, you will arrive at necessary components. This means that if both components are given, this is the first row, the concept is also exists. That means, for example, let's assume that these two components are participation and contestation, electoral competition. If we have participation and electoral competition, 1 and 1, yeah, we have democracy according to our definition. If we have only x1, electoral competition but no participation rights, there's no democracy according to this logic. If we do not have electoral competition, but we have some participation rights, the possibilities to express one's opinion, there's also no democracy according to this way of conceptualizing. And then you have the case of both not existing, which is then also clearly a case of no democracy. If you follow the OR logic, so if you say that the components are substitutable, then obviously, you have differences in the second and the third row of our table here. This probably the concept of democracy consisting of contestation and participation is not a good example here. But take for example, perhaps the welfare state with. To simplify, to have a poverty prevention, that's x1 as a defining element of a welfare state, and an insurance system, an old age insurance system as a component as x2. And if these two components define the existence of a welfare state as a concept, there may be welfare states where we do not have a full poverty prevention, but we have a sort of private based old age insurance, and we still would like to call it welfare state. This is where we apply this substitutability logic, where only one component is sufficient to indicate the presence of the phenomenon measured by the concept.
So there could be more components
Of course, this is a simplification, and with such complex concepts as democracy and governance, you usually have more components to measure them, because, yeah, in the way, if you conceptualize them, you will quickly arrive at a larger number of components that you consider relevant, starting from your concept. Now, I just want to juxtapose here and to clarify the different logics of how to build a concept. Now, if we then go one step further, if we have clarified our concept, how can we measure this? I think there are three different measurement strategies. The best one, perhaps, if it is available, is to rely on objective data. There are examples that one can find in existing governance and democracy measurements. A very prominent example in the democracy and democratization literature is the democracy index produced by Tatu van Hanen, who says that democracy, I would measure democracy by looking at two objective figures. One is the share of the largest party in parliament, and the other one is the participation of the turnout, the participation of people in elections. The higher the turnout and the lower the share of the largest party in parliament, the higher the level of democracy in a country. That's his simple logic. As you can see, these two indicators he uses directly try to reflect the two components that I mentioned in the Dahl concept of democracy. Contestation, electoral competition, that is measured by the degree, by the share of the largest party. He says that, Van Hanen says that the lower the share, the higher the fragmentation of parliament, the higher the degree of electoral competition. And the other component, participation, this is measured by electoral turnout. The higher the turnout, he assumes, the higher the degree of participation and the de facto existence of participation rights. We have other examples that have become increasingly important regarding outcome measurements to measure the governance performance, and this is in the EU, the Lisbon process, that is where states have come to agree on joint indicators of employment policy, of social inclusion policy, and we can also mention here the Millennium Development Goals, a set of indicators that have been agreed in the UN framework to measure development. Now, these may be convincing indicators to measure policy performance, the performance of countries across in certain areas, but the question then arises. Their big advantage is, of course, they are very reliable. They can mostly be easily measured, but the question arises: are they sufficient to represent these complex concepts that we want to measure, democracy and governance? Is really the level of democracy well represented in the electoral turnout multiplied with the fragmentation and the degree of the share of the largest party in parliament? One would probably add immediately a question mark and wonder whether it's really a valid representation of democracy. Now, the alternative, the second best alternative one has is probably to rely on a representative opinion surveys. Let's ask the people what they think about democracy in a country. We have a number of examples here, a number of very important initiatives, such as the Eurobarometer, the Afrobarometer, the World Values Survey. These are very important initiatives. Two questions again, or three questions arise, perhaps, if you try to use them as measures for democracy. Are they feasible in countries with difficult infrastructural conditions? Are they feasible in countries where it is not so easy to establish a representative sample of the population because the quality of national statistics is insufficient? They are costly. You need to have interviews, you need to have at least 1,000 respondents, and from there you also can raise the question, are they really comparable? Of course, we can pose the same questions in every country, but it is uncertain that whether our respondents, our citizens, mean the same thing if they express their satisfaction with democracy. in a particular country, because democracy is, in this sense, inevitably very contextual and very predetermined by culture and by the traditions, the experiences of individuals and of citizens in a country. The third best alternative is to rely on expert assessments. Here we find a broad array of different expert assessments, starting from the well-known surveys of Freedom House, of freedom in the world. They also have developed other surveys that are more encompassing but limited to a smaller number of countries. I myself have participated in a survey, a more recent survey, the expert survey. It's called Bertelsmann Transformation Index, BTI, where we try to ask experts, country experts for 125 countries to evaluate the state of development of market economy and democracy. Regarding governance, you find again a number of different expert surveys. One prominent example for this region, Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, is of course the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Their transition report every year contains a set of transition progress indicators where they measure the progress in privatization, infrastructure development, liberalization, and these ratings are produced by the expert staff of the EBRD. There's also the World Governance Assessment, a survey produced by the Overseas Development Institute in the UK that relies on knowledgeable persons in different countries. So it's a mix between a survey and an expert rating. That tries to assess the quality of governance very broadly. And we have a statistically advanced, methodologically sophisticated initiative by the World Bank Institute. These are the so-called governance indicators that are produced annually that disaggregate governance into 6 dimensions, including rule of law, government effectiveness, political stability, control of corruption, and they are not genuinely measured. These indicators consist of other indicators that exist. They use, for example, the Freedom House data. They also use the BTI data. They use expert ratings from commercial risk rating agencies that provide firms with guidance on where to invest in a country, on give assessments on the political stability, and they aggregate all these different ratings by using a statistical procedure, a so-called unobserved components model that allows one to weight the source indicators according to their representativity, to the degree to which they represent the mainstream of governance assessment. The rationale behind this is that the assumption is that all the sources that the World Bank uses for its governance indicators represent some measurement error. But the extent to which these sources correlate gives, in a way, the set of coinciding assessments of governments, and this is not coincidental, but it is rather this represents, in a way, the true value of governance that is measured by each individual survey, and we have to simply check to what extent these sources are correlated, and the more one source is correlated with the other sources, the higher weight it is given in the aggregation procedure. And this is how they arrive at these synthesized governance indicators. Nevertheless, this is an advanced procedure, but for this procedure one can still argue that it is based on subjective assessments, and these assessments can carry various biases, disciplinary biases, political biases, institutional biases. That means that experts systematically rate certain things not as they are because they view them differently. So this is, of course, the big important drawback of expert assessments. So concluding, I would say that there's no best alternative. All these different ways of measuring governance and democracies have their drawbacks, have their pitfalls, and one has to take care in the measurement design of how to minimize them. What is important is, and what is a big problem in designing measurement strategies is that on the one hand you need multiple indicators in order to avoid the bias that comes with choosing just one indicator. but at the same time you need to ensure that these multiple indicators are equivalent in their meaning, so that you can use them substitutable as substitutes. And I think there are three validity criteria one can set up to check the validity of these indicators. So validity, as I said, is the degree to which the indicators measure what they are supposed to measure according to our concept. First is the content validity. Do they sufficiently represent the concept? Second is what is called convergent discriminant validity. Do they correlate with each other? Are they sufficiently discriminant that they do not correlate with other indicators used? And third type of validity is what is called in the literature nomological validity. That is often difficult to apply and to check whether there is a nomological validity. The idea behind it is that if we have clearly established causal relationships, say for example between democracy and the human development, measured in the Human Development Index by the UNDP, if we can postulate such a clear nexus, then we could use the Human Development Index to check the validity of our democracy measurement. We can also use, of course, other rival democracy measurements to corroborate, to confirm the validity of our own measurement. But obviously this way of doing it is also then fraught with the problem that the alternative democracy measurement may also be biased. So if we have mastered these problems of measurement, these challenges of measurements, the next challenge is one of how to rebuild a composite measure from our different disaggregate components and indicators that we have measured in the measurement phase. First of all, the first question to clarify is, what is the scale level of our measurement? You know from statistics probably that there's a distinction made between ordinal scales and metric scales. Ordinal scales do not have information, do not give information about the distances between the different rank positions in a scale, such as if you are asked, for example, to express your satisfaction with democracy, often surveys give you a set of options starting from very satisfied, highly satisfied, moderately satisfied, not satisfied, so different gradings. These are ordinal scales because you can't clarify, you don't know whether the difference between highly satisfied and moderately satisfied and the one between moderately satisfied and not satisfied is the same. Now the distance may differ. There's no information in the scale implied about the distance. Metric scales assume that we know about the distances. A metric scale is simply your the metric scale we use, of course, to measure physical distances. 1 meter is clearly the double of half a meter, and half a meter is clearly half of 1 meter. You can approximate metric scales by using sufficiently differentiated ordinal scales. Now, if you think you have a metric scale, you are able to measure democracy and governance so in such a differentiated, with such a high level of differentiation, then you have a broad range of weighting and aggregation options. If you don't, if you have doubts as to whether you have a metric or quasi-metric scale, you should stick to an ordinal scale. This implies that you can only aggregate your component indicators by using the median, the statistical mean. You are not allowed to perform arithmetic operations with it if you have an ordinal scale. Standardization obviously matters for weighting. This means that to make your different component indicators comparable, you have to first of all bring them to a common scale. If you, for example, try to aggregate highly differentiated scales with less differentiated scales, this is throws up a problem for weighting immediately as well, because if you have a scale that has only three grades, you often reach the extreme values, whereas with a scale with 10 grades, there is much more dispersion between these two extreme values. Again, we come back then for weighting and aggregation to our initial distinction between dichotomous and gradualist concepts. If you have opted for a dichotomous concept, you would then also opt for necessary components, and this would imply that the minimum reached by one component, because all your components are necessary, your minimum result would be would represent the aggregate result. If you have opted for substitutable components, your maximum result would represent the aggregate results, because all components are substitutable with all other components. That is, in a way, if you have decided to have concepts that realize these two extreme and ideal type options of conceptual construction, there is practically no need to aggregate them or to weight them. You just can take either the minimum or the maximum. The minimum for the necessary component, the maximum for the substitutable components, in order to arrive at your composite measure. Now these are extreme cases, as I said, and often, and as in our example that I mentioned about this embedded democracy consisting of 5 partial regimes, you often have components that are more necessary, such as the electoral regime, the electoral process, and that are less necessary, such as horizontal accountability. Here, the general preference is to, and the general strategy of weighting and aggregation is, the more necessary you consider your components, the more you should use equal weighting and a multiplication as a procedure of aggregating, because with multiplying different component indicators, you imply that one component indicator is less substitutable by another one. If you have a low value on one component, and if you multiply it with a high value on another component, you will still have a relatively low level, in contrast with a low level composite indicator, in contrast with an addition where you have a high degree of mutual substitutability between the components. So 1 plus 5, if you have, let's assume an example, if you have 1 and 5 on the two components, and if you multiply them you arrive at 5, and if you add them you arrive at 6. So this means that the one from the one component slightly increases the composite indicator if you use the addition, whereas if you use the multiplication there's no real effect. So basically you could have also used the 5, the higher indicator. Now, how to determine this conceptual status? I think there are two ways. Either theoretically, if you have clear theoretical ideas in mind on what's the role of the electoral regime, what's the role of political participation rates in your definition of democracy, or you can try to develop and derive a strategy of aggregating and weighting from an empirical study of what you get as results when you do the study. So from your scores on your components. If you choose to do an empirical to explain and derive your weights and aggregation empirically, there are different procedures. I don't want to go in too much detail. I think what is most important here is that you can perhaps maybe I just mentioned it. There's one qualitative strategy, that's qualitative comparative analysis, that's basically works with this Boolean, according to this Boolean strategy that I showed to you, the differentiation between and or. So you look at whether your phenomenon exists and what you try to measure with your concept, and you look at the component indicators and you check whether the component indicator is always present where the phenomenon is also present. This means that this would have then the implication that it's a necessary component and would imply less substitutability, whereas you have whereas you find a phenomenon where you do not have the component. This would imply that you would opt for a more for a high degree of substitutability. A more perhaps better known alternative is an implied statistical procedure is a principal component analysis. This is a strategy to detect structures in data sets. You try to extract by mathematical methods factors that represent most of the information in terms of variance, the statistical information that is contained in the original variable, and the higher the correlation between an original variable and the extracted factor, the more this original variable is representative for what you try to measure with your set of components, and so the consequence would be the higher should be its weight, and the more it should be aggregated by a multiplicative procedure. You can also use regression analysis if you expect a clear causal effect. For example, if you measure governance and say that good governance is associated with high policy performance, with a low unemployment rate, for example, you can try to regress your governance indicators on unemployment policy performance, on unemployment rates, and derive the weights from the contribution that your individual indicators make to explaining the variance in unemployment rates. All these three methods are fraught with different problems. I can talk about them perhaps afterwards if you're interested, but I don't want to go into too much details. These are different strategies of deriving weights and aggregation procedures from the data. Finally, my conclusion is, I think, and the most important the most important rule perhaps that you should take home with you. The concept should determine the index construction principles, not the data. So I would always opt for a top-down logic of constructing measures of democracy and governance. From the concept, you come to the components. You have to clarify the logical, the theoretical status of components. Then you can derive from there different measurement strategies that are most appropriate to capture the components, and aggregation strategies. What has to be kept in mind, validity is something different, is different from truth. Validity is a relational concept. Validity is just about whether the indicators you have chosen measure the ideas represented in your concept. Truth is something philosophers talk about. This is the perhaps more restricted world here of social scientists, and therefore we prefer to work with validity as the measuring rod, the yardstick for comparing concepts and measurements. It's also clear that there is no one-size-fits-all approach of measuring democracy, as there is no one-size-fits-all model of democracy. You have in the world of democracies, or in the world of political regimes, most researchers would, and most people would agree to consider a democracy. You have different institutional arrangements. It's important in your measurement strategy to avoid any fixations, any questions and indicators that are too closely linked to particular institutions. So I would always argue for looking for functions, and the Dahl approach is a very much a functional one, because he looks at basically functions that need to be given in a democracy, and that constitute an ideal democratic process. The fact that there's no universal model of democracy, and there will not be anyone in the future, does not, however, mean that it is impossible to measure and to compare democracy, governance, good governance, the quality of democracy. I think there are conceptual and methodological standards that permit an evaluation of democracy and also a meta-evaluation of democracy evaluations. Yeah, and the idea of my lecture was actually to provide you with some guidance for how these standards could be developed and how they should guide an evaluation both of democracy, of course, and of the ways democracy is measured. Thank you for your attention. I've talked too long.
Do you have a break about 10 minutes?
Yeah, sure, but would you have questions? Or
I have maybe a comment that thank you for telling us so many interesting things. I can share a little bit of my experience when I was visiting academic scholar in the National University of Singapore. I met Professor Brüsisa, and he's the head of the Center of Asian Competitiveness Center, something like that. And he recently published a book called Effective Governance. And as I think if we turn back to that Merkel's model, I think that Singapore fits perfectly to that very, very small part, effective power to govern, but not maybe other parts. And they are especially focused on governance, and particularly on governance. Maybe it could be interesting for you, but they do not actually measure democracy, but that's the point which you stressed about governance. He also has very interesting models, and one interesting thing about his model that he presented during his open lecture was about that effective governance, speaking, rethinking, and everything very effective. And then a Sikh, an Indian man, told that he observed an interesting thing in India, that soldiers were chalking the wall every 2 days. They re-chalked it again, not instead of painting it. And when he asked the general, why do they do this thing? The general said, just imagine if we painted with the color, the soldiers would have nothing to do, as well as the whole India. That's why they're soft and their soft programs are not so popular within the country. They're all for export. So they, that Sikh man, colonel himself, he proposed to add a little bit more culture in this model or something specific things. Just a comment, not a question, but observation. Different models of perception.
Yeah.
hey,